Iranian people all these years. The things that are on your bio, and I'd like to just mention a couple just to underscore what a very influential and important position you have, thank heavens. I just cannot thank you enough, and I know that the participants will also offer their gratitude when they have an opportunity. The congressman who hails from Arizona, how do you call Arizona? The state of Sunshine State. How appropriate, right? The Sunshine State. Exactly. Well, thank you, Congressman. He has served as vice chairman of the House Commerce Committee and chairman of the House Subcommittee on Child Protection and Family Preservation. He's really very devoted to child protection, family preservation, which may not appear to be as relevant, perhaps, as some of his other committees, like the House Working Group on Judicial Accountability and House Working Group on Waste, Fraud, and Abuse. But in my book, that's a very, very important committee, and throughout his life, he has been devoted to family protection and values. He has served on the Budget Committee, the Small Business Committee. Well, that should have been a busy one, since small business is very much in danger, I'm afraid. Now serves on the Armed Services Committee, and as I mentioned, the Judiciary. He's also chairman of the Constitution Subcommittee, which I'm especially happy about, Congressman. Without further ado, I would like to introduce Congressman Franks, and with much gratitude again. Will you be fielding questions afterward? Or not necessarily. You can, depending on the time. Absolutely. Okay. Thank you so much.
Well, good morning. I guess my first thought to all of you is just how grateful I am to be with all of you this morning. It's wonderful to be among a group of people who are dedicated in the core of their souls to the cause of human dignity and human freedom in Iran and across the world. Because ultimately there's something about that echoes in the soul of every person on this earth. You know, there's something in the heart of every person that cries out for this cause of freedom. And I appreciate that you folks have not only resonated in your hearts, but that you've responded to it. And Prince, it's good to see you again, sir. And may I begin first by expressing something that's, I think, very important. And that is just a sincere and abiding affection for every last one of the freedom-loving people in the nation of Iran. And I would ask that you never for one moment would anyone under my voice ever consider my opposition to the radical terrorist government of the present administration in Iran as any sort of disrespect for the noble people in Iran who are forced to live under that regime. And that's very important that you separate the two, because I know sometimes, you know, I've taken a strong position on making sure that we prevent this present government from gaining the reins of nuclear weapons, because I think it has profound implications to everyone. Indeed, it is my belief that one of the greatest short-term threats to the peace and security of the freedom-loving people of Iran, as well as the entire human family, is the radical regime in Iran and their efforts to develop a nuclear weapons capability. I think if our only focus was the people of Iran, we would still be concerned about what this would do. If Mahmoud Ahmadinejad's regime obtains their desired nuclear weapons capability, the prospect of freedom in Iran will be placed out of reach for the perceivable or the foreseeable future. And dissidents will have a harder time on taking on an emboldened government, and other nations will struggle to assist dissidents in the face of a nuclear-armed radical administration. And ladies and gentlemen, if the present regime in Iran indeed gains their goal of nuclear weapons, it will spark a nuclear arms race throughout the Middle East, and ultimately nuclear terrorism will become a horrifying reality throughout the world. 32 years ago, on January 20th, 1981, 52 American diplomats, intelligence officers, and Marines were finally released after being held hostage at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran for nearly 15 months. Americans saw it as the end of a long national nightmare, but in fact it was just the beginning of an insidious shadow falling across the nation of Iran. In the words of one of the dissidents, it was a revolution they thought that would bring them heaven. Instead, it brought hell on earth. And the nightly TV news headlines during those long months called the crisis "America held hostage." But now, 32 years later, it's the people of Iran who long for democracy and freedom and peace, who today are the ones that are held hostage. And so the national elections in July of 2009 became the largest demonstration we have yet seen of the resistance within Iran to Ahmadinejad and his regime. The so-called election sparked an uprising of very courageous Iranian citizens who were willing to pay any price. And indeed, some of them paid the ultimate price in the hope that their children would one day walk in the sunlight of freedom. And I cannot tell you how moved I was by their courage, or how grieved I was that Barack Obama, the President of the United States, remained so silent and spoke no word of support for those noble Iranian soldiers of freedom. It's a hard thing as an American congressman for me to witness that. I see the courage that we so emulate and revere in America in the pursuit of freedom, and yet I see those that are our spokespeople be so silent in that same situation when the support was so desperately needed. And unfortunately, the plight of the Iranian dissidents, citizens, and political prisoners has not improved a great deal since. Every day, more of the God-given freedoms of Iranian citizens are stolen and trampled upon. Every day, they watch the darkness of irrational hate and nuclear ambitions threaten the light of liberty, threaten their peace, and the opportunity that they so desperately hope to hand to their children. And while many throughout the pro-democracy movement in Iran would not stand in the face of the Tehran government's brutality, today, over a year and a half later, the movement has withstood the test of time and terror, and it fights for freedom in Iran. And I think that's probably one of the most telling things that we can witness, is that even in the face of the brutality, the freedom movement has continued. And to that end, I'm so deeply encouraged by what this room represents. It's an assembly of people from a diverse range of backgrounds and persuasions. I know that there's a lot of people here that disagree with one another, and I know that your perspectives and even your strategies are quite different at times, but you have one common goal, and that is bringing true freedom to Iran, and I would humbly encourage you all to continue. The forces of evil cannot and will not prevail forever, and those who seek to overthrow this oppressive regime with the goal of bringing liberty to all Iranians, you're on the right side of history. That's what I want to tell you. Indeed, history has been a witness to countless evil dictators like Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. We've seen many of them. Those who had an unmitigated lust for power and for control, and it led them to carry out unspeakable acts of cruelty against innocent citizens throughout the centuries. But we've also watched truth unfold throughout history, that this sort of evil kind of has a way of collapsing on itself. And when noble and courageous people like all of you refuse to surrender to the weight of oppression and brutality. As President Ronald Reagan said, no arsenal or no weapon in the arsenals of the world is so formidable as the will and moral courage of free men and women. And so I just want to say to all of you, to the noble, freedom-loving people of Iran that might be hearing my voice today or at some time in the future, let me promise you at least this much. God hears your prayers, and He sees your children, and the American people stand with you. I stand with you. And while the flame of liberty burns in the heart of just one Iranian patriot, just one, the hope of freedom in Iran will never die. And one day, Iran will be free. And you'll all look back and say, you know, I'm glad that we gathered in that place in Washington. I'm glad we continued the effort. And it will, my prayer is it'll set a beachhead of freedom that will be the heritage of your children for generations to come. I am reminded as an American, you know, that there was a time when the George Washingtons of the world had to look to colonial soldiers and say, we're going to give you a better tax break if you will join the colonial army. That's not what he said. He said, if you join us, it will be very difficult because we are fighting a great empire, and the challenges before us are monumental. And there's a good chance that you won't make it. You may be a casualty of this effort. But if you win, you will build a beachhead of freedom for coming generations, and you will perhaps launch a great ship of state that will be the flagship of freedom in the world. And they did that, and I'm very grateful to them. And I want you to know that I think that some of you may represent that to the nation of Iran. And I hope that you don't lose your courage, and I hope you know that there's a lot of us that want very much for you to prevail, not just because we're concerned of the threat that nuclear Iran represents to the world and to the outside world, but because we care about the people in Iran, and we want to see them have the light of liberty fall across their face as well. So God bless you all. Thank you. And I guess we have a few moments for questions. I don't know what exactly the time is. I don't want to impose on the Prince's opportunity to speak here. But if you have any questions, I'll do my best.
I have not introduced myself to you because you came a little late. I'm Juliana Pilan. And for those of you who have come a little late, I'm the director of the Center for Culture and Security. I would love to introduce our keynote speaker, but the honor will have to go to Amir Fkhravar, who is the introducer of our keynote speaker. He is a research visiting fellow at, actually not visiting, he's a research fellow. He's been here for a good 3 years, yes. And he is well known to many, certainly to people in Congress and the Senate, as well as the Iranian community, both in the United States and in Iran. So I will, without further ado, I will let him do the introductions, and thank you so much for visiting our school. We are very honored indeed.
Wow, what a long journey. It's 20 years when I started my fight for freedom and democracy, and it was a dream to have the room full of freedom fighters and scholars and the opposition figures, and especially Congressman Trent Franks and Prince Reza Pahlavi. I know Prince Reza Pahlavi for maybe 12 years. We are directly in touch. I knew him. Everybody in Iran, they knew him. But I'm here to just with some short words, just introduce him and tell you how I know Prince Reza Pahlavi. I was in jail for more than 5 years. I was under torture and 8 months solitary confinement in Iran. And in entire my life, for last 20 years, from the time I was 17, my first arrest, I was fighting to just have Republic of Iran. I was Republican in Iran. But it was really interesting for me when 12 years ago, I came out of jail for some days with bail, and then some of our friends from Los Angeles, they put us in touch with the office of Prince Reza Pahlavi. And he knew that we, the student activists in Iran, we have the different ideology and we are fighting for maybe the different views, but he didn't care about that. And he wanted to be in touch with the Iranian people, with the student movement, with the women's movement, with the labor movement inside Iran. And that was the good part. That was the part was really valuable for us. And when 12 years ago, Prince Reza Pahlavi had a press conference, we, for the first time, we spoke on the phone, and then he said, Amir, can you tell me what the Iranian people, the new generation, they want? I don't want to go to the press conference and talk about what we want here. I want to go and talk about what the people of Iran, inside Iran, they want. And we sent him a letter, and he I was shocked when I saw on all the entire Persian TVs, they showed that press conference and Prince Reza Pahlavi, he was reading that letter, the long letter of us, some Iranian student activists, and at the end he even read our name, and that was an honor for us. I want to just thank you, Prince Reza Pahlavi, for all these years. You started fighting for freedom when you were 17. I started when I was 17. And I guess it's the time for all of us to come together. As Congressman Trent Franks, the greatest man I know in the United States Congress, mentioned, we have the different views, but this is the time to come together and for the cause of unity, just put aside all of our differences and work together to bring down the mullah. Prince Reza Pahlavi, please.
Good morning, everyone. First and foremost, let me apologize for my late arrival, which was beyond my control. And I would like to first and foremost thank the Institute for inviting me to this gathering and giving me this opportunity to share a few thoughts with you, Congressman, ladies and gentlemen. In the interest of time, I'll try to be as brief as possible, but try to give you an idea of how we have evolved and where we are today. At first, I can simply say that the very reason for the existence of this regime from day one has never been in the interest of Iran or Iranians, but to export an ideology throughout the world. If you carefully focus on every posture and behavior that this regime has had, particularly vis-à-vis the international community, you can clearly see that no government that will really be attentive to the needs of its citizens will take our country to the brink of possible war on the sole argument that they're trying to produce a few kilowatts of nuclear energy for peaceful purposes. Why would this regime need to have the ultimate weapon in order to establish under its hegemony a regional religious dictatorship and have a deterrent force to force others to have to deal with that new reality without much to be able to be done with, which is of course why the world is very concerned about this regime's ambitions and its dubious, or to say the very least, opaque nuclear program. Having said that, the real issue to the majority of Iranians is not the nuclear issue. It has always been the lack of freedom and human rights in our country. And after 34 years, the situation has become worse than you can possibly imagine. Not just because people are suffering, not just because the economy is in a terrible situation, but this is the first time for a nation that has survived centuries of unity, we begin to hear the ugly face of separatism that could lead to Iran's dismantlement altogether. Not necessarily because the people who can no longer put up to this regime are at fault, but because nothing today gives an Iranian citizen absolute equal rights under the law because of their religious tendencies or ethnic background or political ideology. We have, on the other hand, witnessed for at least a couple of decades an attempt from within Iran to try to see, despite the reality of this regime, an attempt to try to reform this regime. Ever since the arrival on the scene of President Khatami, we have seen many people try to see whether or not they can gradually achieve some degree of more liberalism or more access or more penetration. But at the end of the day, I think everybody today knows the ultimate conclusion, that this regime is irreformable, not just because of its constitution that limits the possibility of any legislation, which is subject to a wanton veto of the supreme leader who could basically decide anything as a last word and controls every aspect of governance in Iran. On the other hand, looking from the outside in, I think one of the most basic problems has been that the foreign policy of many governments, particularly Western governments vis-à-vis Iran, which ultimately led to the addition of economic sanctions to bring pressure on Iran, was not really aimed with the idea of putting an end to this regime, but has been mostly aimed to put pressure for the regime to change its behavior. And I think that leads to a bigger flaw of interpretation. Let me give you this example. At the time of the Cold War, in fact, at the height of the Cold War, when you had the most diametrically opposed ideas on this planet, you had the US on the one hand, symbolizing where the free capitalistic world was standing on, and you had the socialist communist international ideology of Moscow going head to head at each other. However, you could find a moment of rational coexistence of these two diametrically opposed systems that could even have treaties between themselves and coexist in the same sphere of rationality. The problem you have with this regime is that its survival depends on the total defeat of the other side. They cannot coexist in the world, or a world that respects human rights, that respects democracy, that understands secularism, because to them it's like poison. And another reason why this regime cannot stop what it's doing is because it has failed in Iran itself. And unless it scores a point beyond its own borders, its already lost legitimacy will be further proof of its absolute demise. Which is why even on the vague assumption that this regime might, on the 11th hour, back down from its nuclear threat, do you think they will stop at that? Will they stop their support for radical groups or terrorist groups in the region? Bottom line, I think for Iranians, and hopefully today, as I've witnessed in the last few months at least, a change of direction in a lot of thinking going on in various levels of decision-making and governance, particularly in the Western world. There's no question that at this point, we have to come to this conclusion that the core of the problem started with this regime, and the start of change in the Middle East will start by putting an end to this regime. The question, however, is how. Before I get to that, let me explain to you what was it that gave me this incentive to become far more proactive in recent years than I was before. And I have to tell you that the first element I'd like to credit for this is today's generation of young Iranians inside Iran. Particularly after what happened in 2009, which was really the birth of a movement which was short-lived for obvious reasons, known as the Green Movement. While many focused only at the surface of the problem, being contesting the results of a fraud in an electoral process, if you could call the system in Iran as an election, but for what it's worth, it was controversial. But I'm certain that the millions that went into the streets had much more in mind than just contest the result of a vote. It was a far too long kept cry for freedom and for an opportunity to see what they really want. And indeed, it was no surprise. And for those of you who may remember the press conference I had in the National Press Club here in Washington a couple weeks after what happened, I remember saying that this movement will have its ebbs and flows, that we cannot expect people to be on the streets weeks at a time. And the fact that people will be forced to submission, or later on, as we witnessed, many were arrested, tortured, and disappeared, and the leadership of the movement was heavily repressed, that doesn't mean that it's an end of a movement. It's just the beginning of the final phase of this struggle, past the area of giving the regime an opportunity to see whether or not it can be reformed. We could not have let this opportunity go to waste. I could not simply see yet another generation of young Iranians go to waste. And I also didn't think that Iran would have any more chance or time, as the situation prevails within our country, to stay in one piece. The ingredients were beginning to assemble. But beyond what I think has always been the fundamental demands of my compatriots, there was another important issue that we could not address, the huge elephant in the room that nobody wants to talk about, failed diplomacy and the option of war, neither of which can be a solution. Why diplomacy was bound to fail? For the reasons I explained to you earlier. Because you expect the other side to behave rationally and respond to an expectation that you think would make sense. And it has been a waste of time. And in fact, the regime has always tried to buy time and push it further and closer to this infamous red line that everybody, including the Israelis, are talking about. On the other hand, we cannot say that because diplomacy has failed, we have to go straight to a scenario of military confrontation. I've always urged policymakers, decision makers, to focus on this simple truth that in the past 34 years and counting, most of the dialogue that has existed with Iran by most countries and governments has been limited only to the regime and its representatives. And that has never been an official dialogue with the secular democratic forces within Iran, who represent the majority of the Iranian people. We have never asked world governments to cease from communicating or keeping a channel of dialogue open. Of course not. What we have been asking is how come you can deny the majority of the Iranian people a voice, especially when they are on your side vis-a-vis a regime that is not. It simply doesn't make sense. And if you want to find a solution, who better to talk to than the people who are in the thick of it? And they can tell you what can and may not work. My idea was to start working directly and for a change with the people of this generation inside Iran. Not to be misinterpreted as bypassing or putting aside others, but for the simple reality that I think that the only thing that could truly be a basis of a legitimate and grassroots movement has to be based on an inverted pyramid. It has to come from the bottom up. We can no longer have an elitist approach that a few people in a room frame some subject and try to impose it on 70 million people without having a single say in the process. It has to be the other way around for it to have not only a true basis of popular support, and it is also, at this time of our struggle, a movement that has very clear and simple objectives. And the basis of the council that we have proposed and we have been working in diligently for the past 15 months, and the first declaration that has been the basis of this consensus among all who have signed this charter in order to be participating in this movement, has been very pluralistic in the sense that it does not get into arguments of ideological preferences. It simply states that as Iranians, in order to regain our right to self-determination, and in order to be able to measure what people actually think, as opposed to claim we know what people want, the only way to achieve that is to have freedom of elections in Iran, the opportunity to have free and fair elections. If the ballot box is supposed to measure at the end of the day what is the will of our citizens, and until we don't have that moment in time in our country, any other arguments is absolutely irrelevant or almost futile. Irrespective of what we believe, if we believe that it's for the people of Iran to decide their future, then the simple question is, do they have today the opportunity to freely speak their mind and vote their conscience? They clearly don't. And this is why I've said to my fellow compatriots, irrespective of their political ideologies or opinions, being monarchists or Republicans or on the left or on the right of the spectrum, that we can always preserve that vote and ultimately vote what we want when the process allows us to do it. But today we are all in the same boat. If we believe in the tenets of human rights, if we believe in the tenets that one of the key aspects of democracy is to have a secular system where there's a clear separation of religious from government, then we are all, in a way, in the same boat. But we have to be able to start producing by actions rather than by words something that people can cling on to. Because to me, there are three factors that will make the Iranian society actually move. The first aspect is a clear definition of the alternative. Unlike 34 years ago, where it was said, let's get rid of the Shah's regime, then see what happens. Well, guess what? We all know what happens next. And how many people who were part of the revolutionaries of the time actually knew what Khomeini was standing for. This time we're not just saying we want to get rid of this regime, but what do we want instead? What is it going to be and how we can get to it? Very important to understand, if you will, this path. The second factor which is important is, of course, leadership in the form of proper structuring and organization of any movement. I have yet to see any movement of the nature of which we're talking about, which is pretty much based on civil disobedience, succeed without having some degree of coordination in place. And last but not least, clearly, it needs to have a sense of international support. So what we have been proposing, basically, is that the National Council has simply one objective in mind. And the day we achieve that objective, it's the end of its mission, if you will. It is basically to carry out a campaign for our rights as Iranian citizens to be able to conduct free and fair elections in Iran. It's as simple as that. We're not asking world governments to change their rhetoric and their foreign policy to advocate regime change in Iran. All we are asking them is to side with us as Iranians, that we want to be able to have our destiny in our own hands in a democratic process. For those who believe that the regime has to change, of course, that's what we're talking about. It's changing the regime, but not calling it a policy of regime change. It's the consequence of what we ask that will lead to regime change. Why? Because basically the regime is faced with two possibilities, or we are faced with two possibilities. Either this regime will voluntarily, under pressure, back away and allow for that to happen, which we know it won't, in which case we have no other choice but to overthrow this regime. The question is then the method. I want to go back to what I stated a little bit earlier and close on that note. Earlier I mentioned to you that the reason why nothing has changed is because the premise of forcing the regime to change its behavior was flawed to begin with. And in the same context, how could you expect the Iranian people to actually commit to any change? Because I heard a lot of people, not just in Washington, in fact in Congress, but also in Europe and elsewhere. Well, if people are so unhappy, how come they are not moving? To which I said, first of all, how many times do people have to come to the streets and tell you in plain daylight, why aren't you on our side? How many chances do you think people get under such repressive regime to state that? But number two, if you think that Iranian people will actually risk their lives because your objective is only to force the regime to come to the negotiation table to talk to you by maintaining the status quo, you're crazy. Of course they won't. Why should they? However, if this time you say, you know what, we're going to use the instrument of sanctions to bring pressure on the regime from the outside, not that it hasn't worked, but if people know that the consequences of this, if there's this time a direct support for dissidents and activists inside Iran to foment this civil disobedience that I've been talking about, then it makes a whole difference. Then everything changes overnight. This time they say, now we're talking. Now there's a real attempt to change things. And it is not that it's the US government who wants to do that, or the French or British or any other government. It's the Iranian people who want that. And you're simply standing on their side saying, by all means, hell yes, they have to have their day and opportunity to vote freely. This regime doesn't give it to them. We, as democracies around the world, won't want anything less for our own citizens. And Iranians are any less capable or any less worthy of having the very same standards and principles that we hold dear to ourselves. And that's what we're asking for. So, one last issue that I think is also very important for everyone to understand, which is not only part of the spirit of this collaboration among Iranians today who seek, in general, a common goal, it's also part of the process. And I must say that a lot of what went into this thinking, to the extent that I was able to contribute to it, is based on what I've been inspired with, having studied events around the world that has led to successful fruition, many movements that were based on disobedience and non-cooperation. If we study Gandhi and what he did in India, if we study what the ANC did and Nelson Mandela in South Africa, when we look at what happened under Lech Walesa and Václav Havel, to name a few, and of course, when one reads the spirit that went into the thinking that led to the Declaration of Independence in this country, and the vision that the forefathers that put the U.S. Constitution on the map for the first time, we're talking about the same vision. And one part of the vision that we want, that I would like to see in my country, is not just a vision of democracy and human rights and justice and all that, which goes without saying, but it is also the absolute understanding, and I say this to Iranians and foreigners alike, we cannot hope to rebuild our nation unless we go through a process of national reconciliation and amnesty. Now, this is the most critical part of this. Why do I say this? Because the biggest worry of those who are stuck with the regime in Iran today, I'm talking about Revolutionary Guards, members of the Basij, many people who are part of the civil bureaucracy of the country, they'd like to ask the question, rightfully so, what will happen to us if this regime changes? What about our future? Do we have any hope? Do we have any guarantee? To which I say, absolutely yes. You can be part of the solution if you don't want to remain part of the problem. A lot depends on where you line up today. But we want to give you this opportunity because we have to end the cycle of violence once and for all. We cannot begin to think of rebuilding Iran if it's going to be based on settling scores and revenge and accusations and pointing fingers and capital punishment and what have you. It has to stop somewhere. And I'm happy to report that part of this process that we have engaged, and the first document came out of Evin prison. I personally spoke to prisoners in Evin and other famous dissidents within Iran to make sure that what we do has their backing and their support. Otherwise, doesn't matter what we do, it would not have any basis of legitimacy and support. But particularly the fact that this message has resonated and has resonated well within the Basij, within the Revolutionary Guards. I have personally been contacted many times throughout the past few months by saying how much they like to hear this and they like to hear more. And they like to hear it more not just from someone like me, but from other Iranians, that the spirit is there and alive and has to grow. We had diplomats who were working with the regime who are now joining this movement. We've had members of the current Majlis in Iran who have signed under a pseudonym this charter and want to participate. And so basically, the floodgates have now opened, this time in the right direction. It would be therefore a shame if an incident internationally would provoke a stoppage of this process. My biggest fear would be that if we are not successful to put together this alternative in time and place, if something was to happen in the form of a military confrontation or something, you would instantly lose the support of those who could be on our side because they'll be forced to defend the country, and you will lose many Iranians, yours truly included, in that process. All I'm asking as a final statement is give the Iranian people their day in court. Give them one opportunity to hear what they have to say. Give them the benefit of the doubt that if given all the resources, they'll make the right decision. And at the end of the day, none of us have the right to claim what the people of Iran ought to have. All we can claim is to defend their right to decide what they want for themselves, which is what I'm standing for. Thank you very much for your time.
I think we all needed a few minutes just to absorb what has happened and the eloquent words that were said. With me, it resonated in particular because the words that most stand in my mind were why haven't the American officials talked to the people? And I'm reminded, since Richard Pearl is here, I met him back in the 80s when he was one of those who helped members of Congress and of the U.S. Congress meet with dissidents in the former Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc. I was born in Romania under communism and came here when I was a teenager. And those words also that of Prince Pahlavi, to the effect that everyone thinks, well, if people haven't gone into a revolution, then maybe they're not that much against the regime. And as you said, how many times do they have to rise? In Romania, we couldn't rise at all. In Russia, in the Soviet Union, people couldn't. But if it had not been for the efforts of congressmen and senators with whom Richard worked closely, and then in the administration, under the Reagan administration, who knows what would have happened? And there, too, the possibilities of a conflagration were huge. So thank you for coming. And thank you all. I also wanted to mention that some of you may know, there are people here from all over the country who've flown in and driven in, and so this event will resonate further. It is a very tough act to follow, but we do have messages from two of the members of Congress and Senate who were unable to be here, in part because of the rescheduling. Senator John Cornyn has sent a message, and we have his able legislative assistant, Malcolm Warbrick, who will be reading it for us. As you may know, Senator Cornyn is rather visible, but you may know he was elected in 2002 from Texas, and he is now a member of the subcommittee of the Committee on Finance and the Judiciary. He's, of course, the minority whip for the 113th Congress, and he was chosen to be the chairman of the National Republican Senatorial Committee for the 2010 and 2012 election cycles. So we are very, very honored to have Senator Cornyn's support. He spoke, of course, at our previous conference 2 years ago. And Malcolm, please, if you could read the senator's statement. Thank you.
That surely is a tough act to follow. Senator Cornyn regrets not being able to be here today, but he did ask me to read this statement. Although I am not able to be with you today in person, I appreciate the opportunity to share some thoughts with you on the United States policy towards the Iranian regime and the people of Iran. These days, we hear a lot about the Iranian regime. We hear about the regime's nuclear weapons program and the threat that it poses to the United States and our allies. We hear about the regime's direct support for terrorist groups like Hezbollah and their disabling influence in the region. We hear about assassinations and attempts the regime has orchestrated on foreign soil. We also hear the regime's threats, usually from President Ahmadinejad or the Ayatollah, against the United States and our allies. We hear a great deal about the actions and policies of the regime because they are a cause for great concern. But all the discussion about the regime in Tehran should not be allowed to simultaneously drown out the important voice and the aspirations of the Iranian people. We know the regime poses a threat to the United States, but we also know that it has been oppressing its own people since it took power in 1979. The United States Department of State has documented the regime's horrific human rights record. The Iranian media remain censored, the Iranian journalists remain jailed, and the freedoms of speech, assembly, association, movement, and religion remain severely restricted. Yet in spite of the oppression the Iranian people face, in the summer of 2009, millions of Iranians joined together. They stood up, voted for new leadership, and demanded greater freedom. And the world watched as the regime carried out its brutal response, spilling the blood of its own citizens. But the people of Iran were not dissuaded. As we saw again in 2011, protesters throughout Iran staged rallies in support of the Arab Spring, knowing that the regime would once again crack down, arresting, torturing, and prosecuting protesters and critics for their dissent. As the next Iranian presidential election approaches, I have no doubt the Iranian people will remind the world once again of their hunger for freedom. We know that the Green Movement remains active, and we know that the Iranian regime fears them, as it is reportedly taking steps to prevent protests surrounding the upcoming June election. Today, it remains incumbent upon the United States to stand with the Iranian people, who are making great sacrifices to bring democracy to their country. The Iranian people have many allies on Capitol Hill who believe the Green Movement's efforts in 2009 represented only a beginning, and we will continue to push the Obama administration to stand with the Iranian people. I admire you for your passion and your dedication to bringing democracy to Iran, and I wish you well in your efforts. Thank you.